that fossils, and especially dinosaur fossils, have become somewhat of an icon, and people want to own these fossils. So the thing about it is that over the past few years, we've seen this enormous growth in the demand for these fossils, and people are willing to pay like huge amounts for these fossils. I mean, we've had some of the very famous fossils like T-Rex, which was Sue, which was sold for 8.4 million US dollars in 1997. But that is nothing compared to the T-Rex specimen Stan that was sold in 2020 for 32 million US dollars. And now, of course, we have this latest dinosaur that is being sold for this enormous amount of money. It's really quite crazy to think that people are willing to spend this amount of money on a single fossil. I mean, for many of us doing research on dinosaurs, it's like it's so much of money that we don't even have this amount of money to do research on dinosaurs, and people are paying that amount of money on one single specimen.
And there's kind of this sort of ethical tussle that I sort of feel, and I'm sure you would, because you'd love to get your hands on it or be able to research it, is it just a personal trophy? Is that what these amazing creatures should be?
You know, I find it really quite disheartening that in some cases, it doesn't mean in all cases, but in some cases, these fossils really become a trophy. They sit in someone's foyer, or they basically outside their buildings. And what happens is that that specimen is lost to science. That when a private dealer keeps it as their own personal trophy, that means that scientists don't have access to it. And from my understanding, the Stegosaurus specimen is one of the most complete specimens. It has really a huge number of the bones of its skeleton that are preserved, almost 256 specimens or single bone specimens of its skeleton that are preserved. I mean, that is really, really fantastic. But if it ends up with a private owner who doesn't allow it to be studied by the scientific community, then it's completely lost. We won't be able to compare it with anything else that is known about Stegosaurus. And when we try to understand the biology of these extinct animals, we really need to study every single specimen that's available, because each one of them gives us information about that particular individual. And then when you piece all those bits of information together, you have a better understanding of the biology of this extinct animal. And I think if we lose the specimen to science, it'll be a very sad day. I believe.
Tell me, do you know, are there conditions placed on the sale of a fossil like this, a dinosaur like this, about its care, and so that it isn't deteriorating?
As far as I know, there are no restrictions. When somebody buys it, they own it and they can do whatever they wish with it. So in some cases, the specimens are bought by a museum, then that's fine, because they will have curators who will look after the specimen. But in other cases where they end up in a private collection, they can do whatever they want to with it. So that is the difficulty.
I'm wondering, you know, museums are the places where they may be studied. Are they being completely priced out of the market? I can't imagine a museum being able to afford over $40 million to pay for something like this.
You're absolutely right. There is no way museums can afford this. I mean, even if we think about the big museums like the American Museum of Natural History and the Chicago Museum, we know that these are really extremely expensive, even for those big museums. I mean, if we're talking about a small museum like here in South Africa, there's no way we would be able to afford such a specimen. So yeah, it's a really, I think that it's being priced out of the market for natural history museums. There may be a few that could afford it if they have a donor who's willing to buy it for the museum. But if they're usually relying on their own funding, they're never going to be able to afford it.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how hard it is to find a Stegosaurus like this. As you say, it is quite a unique one because there are so many components to it. to find something like this? How rare is it?
I think it's extremely rare. Actually, finding a complete dinosaur is rare in itself, but finding a complete Stegosaurus is even rarer. I think the fact that this animal is so beautifully preserved. I mean, I looked at some of the pictures online and it looks absolutely stunning. The plates, the stegosaurs have these huge plates on their backs, and these are really quite magnificent. And often you get little scrappy pieces of these plates preserved, but it looks like in this one, there are beautiful plates associated with the skeleton. It has wonderful preservation of the bones. In fact, I believe that in some of the bones, there you can see that they have arthritic development in the bones, which suggests that it's an old, mature individual, which in itself is really quite important because this also tells us something about how old these individuals could have lived until. So there's so much of information locked within these bones, and finding such a complete dinosaur is really very, very special. I mean, I can't actually believe that this person found it on their property and just happened to have this wonderful specimen in their own property, in their backyard, literally.
It is remarkable. Has there ever been any rule about finding something like this? And admittedly, perhaps it's on their property, they need to be compensated, but that this needs to be kept for the greater good. Has any country ever had that kind of rule?
Well, I know for South Africa, we have that rule. In South Africa, any fossil found anywhere, whether it's in your own property or not, it doesn't matter. It's considered a national treasure. So any fossil is considered a national treasure, and by legislation should be deposited at a institution such as a museum. So it's protected by law. There are legal ramifications if you actually keep a fossil on your mantelpiece. So there are certainly countries like ours where fossils are protected. I know that in other places, like in Argentina also, fossils are protected. So I think it's really country dependent. In the US, of course, people are taking advantage of the fact that a fossil on your own property is owned by you. So that is the difference.
Yeah. Great to talk to you, Anusuya. It's as you say, it's quite an ethical dilemma that is raised by this, but good to hear some countries do protect them. Thanks so much for your time.
A pleasure. Thank you.